Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Destroy the Old to Build the New by Michael McCreery from November 1963. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So the full title of this piece is Destroy the Old to Build the New, a comment on the state, revolution, and the CPGB, or Communist Party of Great Britain. Its author, Michael McCreery, was a leader of a group called the Committee to Defeat Revisionism for Communist Unity, which was leaving the Communist Party of Great Britain over what they called revisionism. This was at the time, in the early 60s, when the Communist Party of China and the Party of Labor of Albania were leading an effort to criticize Khrushchevite revisionism in the USSR. For more on that, see our playlist on the Sino-Soviet split. I'll put a link to that in the video description. McCreery unfortunately died at a very early age of cancer in his mid-30s. Notably, he was the son of a British general, Sir Richard McCreery. He's therefore an example of the kind of valuable contributions that people from a more bourgeois background can make when they become class traders and assist the proletarian movement. Another example in the UK was Harold Adrian Russell Philby, also known as Kim Philby, who worked in British intelligence and used this position to pass critical information to the socialist camp on multiple occasions. One example is Operation Valuable, a Western effort to overthrow the communist government of Albania, which was defeated in part due to this intelligence. In any case, let's now look at Destroy the Old to Build the New, which comments on the CPGB's program known as the British Road to Socialism, first introduced in 1951, then updated in 1957, as well as subsequently, although it's the 1957 version that McCreery is speaking to in this piece. The British Road to Socialism. The British Road to Socialism was first published in 1951. Since then, it has been redrafted, but it still retains those ideas which provoked such controversy when it first appeared. In this program, the main break with earlier Marxist thought lies in the claim that it is now possible for the working class to win control over the capitalist state in Britain by constitutional means and then transform this capitalist state into one which will meet the needs of the working class. Commenting here, I mentioned the Sino-Soviet split playlist. This was a major feature of the criticisms of modern Khrushchevite revisionism in the CPSU, the so-called peaceful parliamentary road to socialism, etc. Continuing. Thus, quote, at a time of mounting class struggle, when the entire working class is brought into action and is supported by other sections of the population, a general election fought on the issue of a socialist solution to Britain's problems could bring decisive results. It could return to Parliament a socialist Labour and Communist majority, and establish a socialist government which, with the backing of the people, would begin to carry through a fundamental social change. In this way, using our traditional institutions and rights, we can transform Parliament into the effective instrument of the people's will, through which the major legislative measures of the change to socialism will be carried. Using the rights already won in the labor movement's historic struggle for democracy, we can change capitalist democracy, dominated by wealth and privilege, into socialist democracy, where only the interests of the people count, unquote. Working class power is the essential condition for far-reaching social change. The program of a socialist government must therefore aim to consolidate that power, and put an end to the political, economic, and social power of the capitalist class. Only a working class state, with the full support of working people, can carry through the measures that will open the way to socialism. So how is the capitalist state, which serves the interest of monopoly capital, to be transformed into a working class state, which will serve the interest of the working class? Quote, the socialist government will achieve the consolidation of the political power of the working people by ensuring that those in commanding positions in the armed forces and police, the civil service and diplomatic services, are loyal to the socialist government and increasingly representative of the people, and by democratic electoral reform, democratic ownership of the press, and control of broadcasting by the people. In other words, the structure of the state will not be modified, but there will be a purge of all those in high places whose loyalty lies with monopoly capital. Unquote. Why is this program controversial? Because it is just this line of argument which Lenin tore to pieces in The State and Revolution, written in 1917, and The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, written in 1918. Thus, from State and Revolution, quote, if the state is the product of the irreconcilability of class antagonism, if it is a power standing over and above society, and increasingly alienating itself from it, then it is obvious that the liberation of the oppressed class is impossible not only without a violent revolution, but also without the destruction of the apparatus of state power which was created by the ruling class, and which is the embodiment of this alienation. The Paris Commune especially proved that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. The words, "to smash the bureaucratic military machine," briefly express the principal lesson of Marxism in regard to the tasks of the proletariat during a revolution in relation to the state. Unquote. Again and again this point is driven home. Quote, "It was Marx who taught that the proletariat cannot simply conquer state power in the sense that the old state apparatus passes into new hands. As we have seen, Marx meant that the working class must smash, break, shatter the whole state machine." Unquote. Lenin emphasizes, and we in the working class movement in Britain in particular need to remember that democracy is a form of the state. Quote, "A democratic republic is the best possible shell for capitalism, and therefore, once capital has gained control of this very best shell, it establishes its power so securely, so firmly, that no change, either of persons or institutions, or of parties in the bourgeois democratic republic, can shake it." We must also note that Engels is most definite in calling universal suffrage, or the right to vote, an instrument of bourgeois rule. Universal suffrage, he says, obviously summing up the long experience of German social democracy, is the gauge of the maturity of the working class. It cannot, never will be, anything more in the present-day state. Comment here, we talk about this from time to time on the channel with regard to do socialists vote, etc. When Engels said that voting was a gauge of the maturity of the working class and not anything more, what he explained that he meant by this was that working class parties should run in the bourgeois elections, but basically just to gain attention. In other words, to advertise their existence and the existence of the movement to end capitalism, to disrupt capitalist politics, but to expect that they were just going to take power and take over the bourgeois state was not it. So basically it was like a head count, a sort of show of support for socialism and against capitalism, or again a gauge of the maturity of the working class. Continuing the Lenin quote, "The petty bourgeois Democrats, such as our own Socialist Revolutionaries, which was a party of the peasantry, and Mensheviks, similar to reformist Social Democrats today, and also their twin brothers, all the social chauvinists and opportunists of Western Europe, accept just this more from universal suffrage. They themselves share, and instill into the minds of the working people, the false notion that universal suffrage in the modern state is really capable of ascertaining the will of the majority of the toilers and ensuring its realization." Unquote. It follows that Parliament must not be regarded as the means whereby the working class win power. In criticizing a statement of Kautsky's which read, quote, "The aim of our political struggle remains, as hitherto, the conquest of state power by winning a majority in Parliament and by converting Parliament into the master of the government," unquote, Lenin wrote, quote, "This is nothing but the purest and most vulgar opportunism, repudiating revolution in deeds while accepting it in words," unquote. The real road to power for the proletariat and its allies, Marx, Engels, and Lenin maintained, was not into the parliamentary cul-de-sac, but through proletarian dictatorship. As Lenin wrote in The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, quote, "The formula, dictatorship of the proletariat, is merely a more historically concrete and scientifically exact formulation of the proletariat's task of smashing the bourgeois state machine, about which both Marx and Engels, in summing up the experience of the Revolution of 1848, and still more so of 1871, spoke for 40 years, between 1852 and 1891. The capitalist state machine will be broken up by the working class, who will use their own organizations to achieve this. It is these organizations which will constitute the main weapon whereby the capitalists are overthrown. These, and not Parliament. It is these organizations which will form the nucleus of the new working class state. These, and not Parliament. Although, of course, once power has been won, and the dictatorship of the proletariat firmly established, Parliament can be transformed into an instrument of the people's will." Unquote. Until the final and decisive struggle for power, we cannot be sure just what forms these working class organizations will take. They may be councils of action, shop stewards' committees, trades councils, or some new form of organization. But in essence, whatever their form, they will be centers of working class power, Soviets. And Soviet means council in Russian. The means whereby the working class exerts superior force against the capitalist state in order to win power. This is why Lenin wrote in Left-Wing Communism, quote, Gallagher fully understands that only workers' Soviets and not Parliament can be the instrument whereby the aims of the proletariat will be achieved. And of course, those who have failed to understand this up to now are hopeless reactionaries, even if they're the most highly educated people, most experienced politicians, most sincere socialists, most erudite Marxists." Unquote. On the question of whether this road to socialism was likely to be a peaceful or a violent one, Lenin was equally adamant. In 1918, when commenting on Marx's view, expressed in the 1870s, that a peaceful transition might be possible in England and America, he wrote, quote, "The revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat is violence against the bourgeoisie, and the necessity of such violence is particularly created, as Marx and Engels have repeatedly explained in detail, by the existence of a military clique and a bureaucracy. But it is precisely these institutions that were non-existent precisely in England and in America, and precisely in the 1870s when Marx made his observations. They do exist in England and in America now." Unquote. And in the 1960s, have they disappeared? For this leads us to consider the developments in the world since Lenin's time. We have seen that the British road adopts, on this question of the relation of the state to the proletarian revolution, an attitude which is identical in essentials with that advanced by right-wing opportunists in the past. But since the 1920s, there have been immense changes in the world as a whole and in Britain. Do these changes justify us today in contradicting Lenin's teaching? Let us look at one of the most recent justifications. A quote from James Klugman's article in Marxism Today of October 1960, quote, "Within imperialism, ever more restricted by the growing socialist system, the general crisis deepens. Imperialism is weakened, it attacks all sections of the people, not only the working class, but the peasantry, town petty bourgeoisie, intellectual and professional people, even the smaller capitalists. Imperialism becomes more reactionary. It tends more and more not only to attack the living standards of the people, but to attack the limited democratic rights that the working people have won within capitalism, to renounce national sovereignty, to reject and turn against all that is best and most progressive in its own cultural heritage. It becomes identified with a policy and strategy of nuclear war. In this situation, more and more clearly, the working class stands forth as the truly progressive force of each nation, the leader in the defense of peace, national sovereignty, liberty and democracy, the cultural heritage. Opportunities arise in a way that did not previously exist to the same extent, of developing a broad political alliance around the working class for peace, democracy, independence, living standards, and cultural progress. At the same time, the ideas of socialism gain ground amongst the working people. Externally, the rise and strengthening of the socialist countries exercises a growing moral and ideological influence amongst the peoples of the capitalist countries. Moreover, the stronger the socialist camp, the more opportunity there is for preventing imperialist interventions against countries that take the socialist road. The more opportunity exists for giving economic and cultural aid to the peoples building socialism. Imperialism is no longer able to threaten, blackmail, and intervene in the old way. The conception of the British road to socialism was that, taking into account the new, more favorable relation of class forces in the world and inside Britain, taking into account the specific traditions and institutions that have developed in Britain, it was now possible for the working class to win around itself a broad popular alliance to win political power, to win a communist and genuine socialist majority in Parliament, to transform the capitalist state into a state representative of the interests of the working people, and to build socialism in Britain, not without continuous class struggle, but without armed conflict." Unquote. This passage deserves a careful reading. The first 3 paragraphs outline, correctly, the main development since Lenin's time, the rise of the world socialist system, and the more favorable prospect which this has created for isolating monopoly capital in Britain prior to its final overthrow, and for preventing imperialist intervention to restore the old order after a successful socialist revolution. The prospect of toppling monopoly capital is greater than in Lenin's time. The prospect that the revolution can be achieved with a minimum of violence, and without prolonged civil war, also greater. But even on Klugman's own analysis, the prospect of a constitutional revolution, of a legal transfer of power, is smaller. For he himself emphasizes that as imperialism weakens, and it is much weaker than it was at the beginning of the century, it, quote, tends more and more to attack the limited democratic rights that the working people have won within capitalism, unquote. We all recognize that Parliament plays a less important role within the Constitution than in the past. If any conclusion is to be drawn from this, it is that the possibility of using, quote, the specific traditions and institutions that have developed in Britain, unquote, meaning our constitutional liberties, to win power by peaceful, legal constitutional means is fainter than it was in Lenin's time. If there has been a curtailment of constitutional liberties, then constitutional advance to socialism is less likely. In fact, the conclusion which Klugman seeks to draw in the fourth paragraph simply does not emerge from the preceding evidence. Quote, imperialism, writes Klugman, becomes identified with a policy and strategy of nuclear war, unquote. But what does this entail? Greatly increased militarization of the state. In fact, as all comrades know, the bureaucracy, the military and police, and the propaganda machine have together been immensely enlarged since Lenin's time, as a direct result of the deepening crisis of capitalism. If the need to smash the capitalist state machine was particularly created, quote, by the existence of a military clique and a bureaucracy, unquote, in the 1920s, then this must be even more necessary today. This immense, top-heavy military and bureaucratic apparatus, which has been built up by British imperialism to contain the growing contradictions, which threaten to disintegrate its system, can never be transformed from within by legal means. It must be smashed from without, by force. Let us look at just what is involved in achieving power by constitutional means. Quote, at a time of mounting class struggle, when the entire working class is brought into action and is supported by other sections of the population, a general election fought on the issue of a socialist solution to Britain's problems could bring decisive results. Unquote. What an assortment of wishful thoughts. Consider the situation envisaged by the British Road in this passage. When is, quote, the entire working class, or even a major part of it, quote, brought into action? Only during a widespread or general strike. There have not been many such situations in British history. The general strikes of 1842 and 1926, the 1919 struggle, described so vividly in Gallagher's Revolt on the Clyde, can be cited. They were all potentially revolutionary situations which might have developed into revolution, given correct revolutionary leadership of the working class. At such times, as the capitalists well know, either the workers and their allies press on to seize political power and smash the bourgeois state machine, or the bourgeoisie re-establish their grip and crush the revolutionary forces. That class which can exert superior force at the decisive moments will win the struggle for power. That is why it's essential for the revolutionary leaders to maintain the initiative, preserve the cohesion of the revolutionary class and its allies, exploit every disagreement between different sections of the bourgeoisie, and vitally important, win over decisive sections of the armed forces. Hesitation and delay at such a time would be fatal. Yet this is the moment when the Communist Party of Great Britain, instead of leading a revolution, will call for a general election. What a farce. What a negation of revolutionary leadership this would be. For such a slogan, such a demand surrenders the initiative to the ruling class. They can then decide whether or not acceptance would best serve their interests. In all probability, the demand itself would cut very little ice on either side, and would only serve to isolate the CPGB from the immediate and unconstitutional struggle. It would be like throwing a stone into mountainous seas, the two great classes locked in mortal combat, and the demand for a general election. But if the CPGB could obtain mass support for such a demand at such a time, might the ruling class not decide to follow their lead and hold a general election? For would this not give them a breathing space, of which decisive advantage could be taken? As a necessary preliminary, the general strike would have to be called off. No general election would be possible with the country paralyzed by a general strike. One could not even print the ballot papers. But once the strike is called off, the revolutionary enthusiasm and energy and activity of the masses must inevitably subside. Activity is followed by passivity. The masses are no longer controlling events. They are waiting upon them, as is usual in capitalist society. Amen. In fact, the class struggle could no longer be mounting, it would be declining. During the following days and weeks of the election campaign, the capitalists would close ranks and unite most of the petty bourgeoisie, the middle classes, and many of the less class-conscious workers around the defense of the Constitution and traditional British liberties. For note that this general election will be decided, according to the British Road, on the issue of socialism, for or against a socialist revolution. Day after day, the press, radio, and television would pour out a flood of calumnies and lies to bewilder and confuse the revolutionary masses. For or against Red Revolution, liberty or tyranny, the united front between the workers and their allies would soon crumble. Opportunist leaders would waver and then turn against a full socialist program, quote, at this stage. Comment, this guy knew what he was talking about, I really have to say here. I'm enjoying this. Continuing, before long, the ruling class would be in a position to isolate and strike hard at those who persisted in presenting the revolutionary alternative to capitalism. Indeed, the moon will turn blue before we succeed in winning a majority to vote for socialism within the legal framework of the capitalist constitution, and with the bourgeois state machine unbroken. But let us assume this blue moon. Parliament has been captured. The socialist government has been duly summoned to Buckingham Palace and sworn in. It then proceeds with the task of transforming the capitalist state into a working-class state. The purge of capitalist-minded civil and military authorities begins, but they're all capitalist-minded and bitterly hostile to the new government. Will they meekly accept the order to dismiss? No one in their right mind will assume that state monopoly capital would commit suicide. The British Road states, quote, "The capitalist class cannot be expected to surrender its wealth and power without a struggle. The big capitalists, whose interests are threatened by the advance to socialism, are likely by every means in their power, constitutional and unconstitutional, to hold back the movement. At all stages in the struggle for progressive policies and for socialism, therefore, the working class and progressive movement needs to be vigilant and, if necessary, to use its political and industrial strength to defeat any attempts by the big capitalists to restrict democratic rights or block the road to democratic advance. This will be of particular importance when the socialist government is established and begins to carry through measures to break the economic and political power of the big capitalists. The extent to which the working class is alert and prepared to use its strength in support of the government's measures will determine whether the big capitalists accept the democratic verdict of the people or attempt to resist it by force." Unquote. In this passage, we have recognition that the ruling class may use unconstitutional means of checking the revolution if constitutional means don't suffice. But what are unconstitutional methods? Quite simply, the use of force, the use of the army, to overthrow the constitutional, quote, socialist government. How is this threat to be countered? By mobilizing, quote, the political and industrial strength, unquote, of the people. But political parties and trade unions cannot stand against an army. There's no escaping the need at some stage of the revolution for armed strength to back the political and industrial strength of the people. Only the people in arms can counter a putsch by the army. To ignore this fact is to ensure the defeat of the revolution. But it is ignored in the British Road to Socialism. It has been said that those who criticize the British Road are dogmatists. And commenting, I'll bring in my favorite Hoja quote, one of them, dogmatic, parentheses, meaning Marxist-Leninist. Continuing, but dogmatists are surely those who stick to a point of view in the face of all the evidence. A program which revises basic Marxist teaching on the role of the state, which rejects the accumulated experience of the working class, is dogmatic beyond belief. With such an obviously false perspective, is it any wonder that there's widespread reluctance within the CPGB to accept this document? The British Road is like one of those medieval paintings, produced before the laws of perspective had been fully grasped. The foreground, our decaying capitalist society, is seen in all its ugliness. In the background, a socialist Britain stands out in full glory. But the middle distance, the intervening ground which links the two and should give coherence to the whole picture, is somehow blurred. The perspective of advance is false. For this, there is no excuse. The laws of perspective have been discovered by Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and we must apply them to Britain. That's the end of the piece. There's a note here that it was repeatedly rejected for publication in Marxism Today, the monthly journal of the CPGB. And I just have to add, pieces like this are why I am an anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist. When I first started studying communism, I was unaware of the depth of the problem of revisionism. And in the first year or so, I even kind of mocked it. Wow, this Hoja guy is calling everyone a revisionist. What a nut. But yeah, actually it was that bad. And still is. I mean, you can see what happened to the socialist camp. And still, there's dozens of parties laden with bourgeois ideology, trying vainly to resurrect a movement which is already in the grave. It's not coming back. To put a stake through the heart of imperialism as needs to be done, I've basically come to the conclusion that we need a reboot, a rebirth of this whole thing. And really it is anti-revisionist pieces which make any kind of sense to me now when I read them, having studied the fundamentals. You know, it's easy to read some Xi Jinping without a solid basis in Marx, Engels, Lenin, etc. and to let yourself get carried away by these sort of paper-thin, very superficial populist appeals and nationalism. But after you study more, you realize it just isn't grounded in Marxism. Like, whatever they're doing, that's not what it is. So I stand with the criticism that McCreery launched in this piece, and with others who think and act likewise, because we're not going to get anywhere as a movement. We're not going to end capitalism. We're not going to have the revolutions in multiple imperial core countries that are necessary to bring this system down and keep it down by tolerating this kind of revisionism and opportunism. It's not going to lead to success, and it's the kind of thing that Lenin would have written multiple entire books about. I mean, people familiar with Lenin's works know that he probably spent 2/3 of his publication space attacking the many forms of opportunism that were prevalent in his day. Maybe more. By being anti-revisionist, we are carrying on the mantle of Lenin. And of course, everyone tries to claim this, but you gotta look at the substance. And you gotta be familiar with Lenin. You have to have done the reading in order to tell who's who, what's what, which is which. And it's not about following Lenin the man per se, because, he smelled so good, he was such an outstanding human, etc. That's not the point. It's the accumulated experience of the working class, and it just so happens that in the history of this class struggle, Lenin was an excellent social scientist, analyzing many situations which are still relevant today because the same class forces are in motion, and we're still in the same basic historical moment, and it's vital knowledge that Lenin helped to uncover and shine a light on. It's super relevant, and there's no point to just reinventing the wheel by trying to vibe it out when we already have all this history, so that's why we do this study. So, this piece also comes with an addendum. It's titled 2 Letters on the Need to Build a Marxist-Leninist Party in England, Scotland, and Wales. And we're going to read both of them. Here's letter 1. Dear Jim, we can agree that an opportunist faction which controls the party organizationally has, over a period of years, denied the press to Leninist arguments, with occasional exceptions, and denied branches the right to hear speakers put the Leninist view on theoretical and practical questions. That they have a mass base for their line does not alter the fact. This faction has, therefore, not operated the basic principles of democratic centralism over many years. These principles must be operated in order to achieve a correct line and advance those slogans which meet the needs of the party and the working class in each historical period. We cannot arrive at the truth as a party and act upon that correct understanding of objective reality when the basic methods of party work are being flouted by the party leadership, which, through its organizational control over the party, is self-perpetuating. The argument, therefore, which you advance, that we must work to win a majority of the party to our way of thinking, by working away within the permitted framework laid down by the opportunist leadership, is not a correct one, because the means whereby party opinion can crystallize around a correct subjective understanding of the objective world do not exist. The facts on Yugoslavia, India, Albania, etc. are not printed in the party press, and only appear, if at all, in distorted form in the capitalist press. How can the majority ever be won under such circumstances, no matter how rapidly objective conditions develop? Looked at another way, I'm saying that a Marxist-Leninist, a communist party, does not yet exist in Britain. Our job is to create one, and that cannot be done without organizing, uniting the Marxists to fight the revisionists for the minds of the militant workers, a big proportion of whom remain within the CP because of its association with the revolutionary traditions of other peoples, notably the peoples of the USSR, and because it alone claims to stand for a socialist alternative to capitalism. It is necessary to begin by pulling together an alternative leadership to the Social Democrats who captured the party organization, and that cannot be done without breaking party rules as operated by them, in defense of democratic centralism. To quote Lenin describing what I maintain is an analogous situation, quote, "It is the fact that the whole of the German Social Democratic Party, and the same is true of the French and other parties, does only that which pleases Südicum, or which can be tolerated by Südicum. Nothing else can be done legally. Everything honest, everything really socialistic that is done in the German Social Democratic Party is done in opposition to its centers, is done by avoiding its central committee and central organ, is done by violating organizational discipline, is done in a factional manner in the name of anonymous new centers of a new party, as was the case, for instance, with the manifesto issued by the German lefts and published in the Berner Tagmacht on 31st May of this year. As a matter of fact, a new party is growing up, gaining strength and being organized, a real workers' party, a real revolutionary social democratic party, unlike the old, rotten, national liberal party of Legin, Südicum, Kautsky, Hausa, Scheidemann and company. It is necessary to proceed to the building of a revolutionary organization. This is demanded by the changed historical situation. It is demanded by the epoch of proletarian revolutionary action. But it is possible to proceed in this direction only over the heads of the old leaders, the stranglers of revolutionary energy, over the heads of the old party, by destroying it." Unquote. That's from Collapse of the Second International. We have that here on the channel. In practice, one cannot separate the party from the leadership around which it has been built up over many decades. To talk of winning a majority against them within the rules they operate is to dream of the impossible. You, as an educated Marxist of deep conviction and of strong character, have influenced maybe 50 comrades over recent years, by standing firm as an individual against strong moral pressure and operating within the permitted legal framework. But how many who have not chanced to meet you, or other Marxists within their branch, have been lost to our movement in the past 20 years? Comrades of energy and enthusiasm, whose development into Marxists could not proceed without help from those of greater experience. For every one that individuals such as ourselves have been able to influence, 10 have been lost to the movement. The social democratic leadership of our party will never budge from their general line of pushing the existing labor movement, unions, co-op, and labor party into more radical actions, but always within the confines of imperialism, within the laws of our capitalist constitution. They will continue to cover this general line of betrayal with a thin pseudo-Marxist fig leaf. This is their role objectively. Whatever their subjective motives, objectively they have betrayed the working class. This general line which they represent, and the organization which they have built up around them to implement it, is not Marxist. It cannot be changed from within. We can only build a revolutionary Marxist party by smashing the old party, by appealing over the heads of the leadership of the CPGB to all honest militants within the working class movement. All best wishes, Michael McCreery. Commenting, I don't know how many people have described a very similar, if not the exact same situation within the CPUSA today. And continuing on to the second letter now. Dear Jack, many thanks for your letter. I am sorry that John and Mary don't yet see the need for an alternative party built around an alternative leadership. Why is this necessary? Because the CPGB has been built up, at least over the last 20 years, around a group of men whose political philosophy is left social democratic, not Marxist. This radical philosophy was well outlined in Harry Pollitt's Looking Ahead, published in 1947. And although it was later withdrawn, its main idea, implied in all the actions of the leadership of the CPGB, both before and after its publication, re-emerged in the first draft of the British Road to Socialism, moved by John Golan, and accepted by the party in 1951. Full discussion in party press and party branches being denied by the leadership, then and subsequently. What is the essential idea around which the political philosophy of these men is built up? It is the idea that it is possible to win working class power by capturing the existing machinery of state. Marxists, however, have always held that the capitalist state machine can never be captured, but must be smashed. All socialist revolutions have confirmed in practice the truth of this theory. It is a universal truth. Stemming from this basic error are all the main false ideas contained in the British Road to Socialism, which motivate all the practical actions of the CPGB. E.g., the false idea that the Labour Party must be transformed into a socialist party before the working class can hope to capture state power. Left Social Democrats unite. The false idea that the trade unions, organizations with an economic aim, have it within their power to transform the political character of the Labour Party, tied as it is to the capitalist constitution, hook, line, and sinker, which implies that the trade unions can be transformed into political organs of the working class via the capture of leading positions in them by communists and left socialists. Either we pursue a general line of turning toward the working class, the mass of the people, to mobilize them for action against capitalism, despite capitalist laws, the capitalist constitution, or we pursue a general line of attempting to capture the existing legal organizations, economic and political, in which workers are to be found, with the aim of capturing finally the machinery of the state within which they operate. The road to socialism lies through mobilizing the common people for action against capital, not through the capture of existing organs of state. This is not to say that whilst the main aim is to mobilize the masses, to release their great potential, revolutionary energy, we do not at the same time, and as a result of success in this main task, welcome the capture of all existing legal positions by progressives. Successes in this field are important, indeed vital, but because they advance the main aim, which is to mobilize the common people for action, not because in themselves they bring us one whit nearer to working class power. One must conclude that there is no Marxist-Leninist Party in Britain today, nor has there been for at least 20 years. There is an organization, the CPGB, which purports to be Marxist, within which there are many individuals with a correct Marxist understanding, but the organization is left social democratic. This is the practical result of implementing radical bourgeois philosophy. There is no real mass line. There is only constitutional work within the legal framework of imperialist Britain. To restrict party work to this is to abandon the aim of revolution, to become an appendage of the Labour Party, itself an appendage of the capitalist state. In your letter you recognize, and this is the essential and vital point of agreement between us, quote, the need to build up a cadre force capable of producing an alternative leadership inside a real Marxist party, unquote. The only doubt I have with regard to this formulation is to the word inside. Leadership is not inside, but of a Marxist party, because a Marxist party can only be built up around a Marxist leadership. You will know that no social democratic party has ever been one for Marxism. The present leadership has built up the party around itself and in its own image. Further, all Marxist parties have had small beginnings. It was a handful of men who founded the Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party of China, the Cuban Revolutionary Party, etc. When you write, quote, do you agree that to the extent to which we win support inside the CP now, and when the time comes when we find ourselves in a position to create the real alternative, i.e. a real Marxist party, that we can be stronger to the extent of saving us time, valuable time, for building up a strong cadre force, unquote, you are, in effect, postponing the establishment of an alternative leadership on the grounds that we have not yet a sufficient number of cadres to establish this leadership. This is not true. Marx and Engels were only two, but they regarded themselves, and correctly, as a party leadership, and fought to win mass support for the correct line they advanced for over 40 years. Today in Britain, the knowledge of Marxism is much more widely spread. There are more than two who can now collectively establish that Marxist leadership which the working class and the working people must turn to as conditions deteriorate in Britain. But the growth of a Marxist party can only follow the establishment of a leadership. It cannot precede it. In effect, you are asking for the impossible. Can the establishment of a leadership be achieved without a breach of the rules of the CPGB as interpreted by the revisionists? No, it cannot, any more than state power can be won without breaking capitalist laws. The breach of democratic centralist procedure by a revisionist faction forces Marxists to unite in defense of democratic centralism. That is the significance of the appeal which I am proposing that you sign. It unites Marxists within the party in defense of the basic principles of communist work, through operation of which collective opinions can be formed and collectively acted upon. The truth can be arrived at in no other way than by observation of the principles of democratic centralism. When you write, quote, it needs to be remembered that the basic unit of Communist Party organization is the branch, not the individual, unquote, as a reason for opposing the appeal. Your remark only makes sense in the light of an assumption that the Communist Party is a Marxist party which is implementing the principles of democratic centralism. But you well know that it is not. The press is now completely denied to us. Branch meetings are completely denied to us. For years, in fact. Leninist opinions and arguments have been deliberately excluded from the party press and party branches, and only the occasional letter and article has been allowed to create the illusion that the opposition was weak and that it was allowed its say, e.g. one or two of my pieces were allowed basically because I believed they still hoped to win me, and as a result I have emerged as a known opponent to the revisionist line, but many other comrades have been completely silenced for years, denied the party press. We can prove this. But only if the party press is open to Marxist argument can the alternative leadership emerge to challenge the opportunists on a national level. While Marxists are restricted to short, verbal contributions in their own branches, the alternative Marxist leadership can never emerge. The minds of the active cadres cannot be reached. Arguments must be hammered home again and again in print and verbally in order to win conviction on questions of basic theory and on vital practical issues. Closure of the branches and the party press to us makes this impossible unless we take extraordinary action. The fraction which dominates the party calls itself Marxist-Leninist. Then let us expose it for its failure to act in a Marxist-Leninist manner. The abandonment of democratic centralism by the party leadership compels Marxists to expose this betrayal. If not now, when? A public statement must be made by all Marxists in the CPGB, and a public campaign launched in England, Scotland, and Wales to expose revisionism. The onus of splitting the party is upon the revisionists, and all militants will recognize this to be so. Many, of course, will not recognize this initially. Many will not at first understand our action, but sooner or later they will do so if they remain active and honest, for objective developments will force the truth upon them. All the best, Michael McCreery. And that's the end of the audiobook. I'd really like to say thanks to the patron who recommended this reading. I see a lot of my own thinking in Michael McCreery's work. The several references to basic theoretical questions ring out to me because, to me, it is common sense, basic Marxism-Leninism. If you read the works of Lenin, and you're honestly open to what it says, and you don't engage in deliberate mental gymnastics to try to distort it, it's very clear, and this is still what we must do now. Establish anti-revisionist communist leadership, and as capitalism teeters toward another massive global crisis like 2008, prepare to win the minds of the advanced workers and organize for the situations that will be emerging. That's it for me. What do you think? Leave a question or comment in the comments area below, and we will continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. You can support for just a few dollars a month or more, or make a one-time contribution. This channel is viewer supported, and we don't run ads or sponsorships, so that support is vital. We really appreciate it. If you like this channel, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, and subscribe. And remember to take what you've learned here into your local left and apply it in the class struggle where you live. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.